So the book of Esther, really good book, but very different than the other 65 books. So what makes it so different? There's no mention of God in the book of Esther. It's the only one. In fact, this has been such an issue. So let me ask it this way. How big of an issue has Esther not mentioning God in it been? Such a big issue that what? There's been a lot of people who thought it doesn't even belong in the Old Testament. But we are very thankful and very grateful that it did indeed end up in the Old Testament. Because it is a wonderful book, but again, it's very different. And we're studying along because of it, and we've taken a pause in Ezra because we're putting it in its time frame that it belongs, because there's so many really interesting things in the book of Esther. So, and we can only speculate, but it's such an intriguing question, I feel it's worth at least speculating for a couple of minutes. Why do you think that the name of God is never mentioned in the book? Does anything strike you as to why the name of God it never appears in the book? It's a hard question, a really, really hard question. And I don't know that, well, no one's really got the definitive answer because I don't really think a definitive answer exists. You can think of some ideas. The book is, in essence, teaching us what? It's teaching us about God's providence, and we're going to see that. I want to essentially kind of summarize every chapter. That's probably going to take us most of today. But summarize each one of the chapters and then move on to the actual lessons that we get from the book. But all of those lessons pretty much are going to rotate around the idea of providence. So because it's teaching about the providence of God, it's able to communicate the message. And of course, the message of Esther isn't set in a context of Israel, is it? It's set in what context? Of Persia. In fact, the book covers a 10-year period. Remember, I had mentioned to you that between Ezra and Nehemiah, there's somewhere around 60 years. And in between the first two sections of Ezra, so we go through chapter 6, so between chapter 6 and 7, there's somewhere around 60-ish years. And in those 60 years, you have the book of Esther. And that covers about a 10-year period. And set in a Persian context, it's trying to recount this history of God's people. And the history of God's people is told in a very Persian way, an us versus them kind of way. Us meaning the Jews, I don't mean to take on the identity of but us meaning the Jews versus them being the Persians. And the account is able to be told without including who? Without including God, specifically as it's being told. But of course you can't tell it without including the Jews. And it does include the Jews. In fact, some have described it as being very Jewish nationalistic. And I understand what they're saying, and you'll probably understand what they're saying as we kind of recount the book as we go through it. But this is a book that the actual hand of God isn't necessary to have it overtly mentioned, because you're still seeing it where? In the actions that are taking place between the Jews and the Persians. And so that's been an explanation as to why it doesn't include the mention of God in the book. Nothing will ever tell us why it doesn't have it. This is just something for us to think about. So let's kind of get to Esther. Who wrote the book of Esther? Who wrote the book of Esther? When most preachers stand up and talk about the Bible, they will say that it was written by about 40 people. I'll say this again. The New Testament was written by how many people? About 8. If you don't think that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, if you were here every night, Jeremiah made a little slip up, if you caught that. But if you don't think that Hebrews is written by Paul, it was written by 9. I think it was. So it ends up being 8. So 8 or 9. And that leaves about another 30 some odd authors for the Old Testament. And when we say about, we don't know. Because Esther could have been written by none other than who? Jewish tradition assigns it to Mordecai. Jewish tradition assigns it to Mordecai. Doesn't mean that he wrote it. Could have been written by Esther herself, but it more than likely written by one of those two. And it's telling us the account of her coming to power and then being able to save the people of God. So let's kind of start thinking about this and understanding it in its historical context. Because a lot of times there are lots of people who want to criticize the Bible because a lot of it stands kind of outside of world history. And that becomes a problem for people in their belief. Not as much the case in Esther. So we get started in Esther chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. Who was that? Ahasuerus. He was Xerxes, the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. So Xerxes was an absolutely known Persian king. Not only was he known through the book of Esther, but he was also known from historical records, again, outside of the Bible. So Ahasuerus is the Hebrew name of the name Xerxes. Xerxes ends up being the Greek name, and literally the Persian name is unpronounceable. I'm not even going to give it a shot. A lot of Persian words seem to pull a lot of consonants out. So if we think about sounding out the word and there's no consonants there, or there's no vowels there, it pulls the vowels out, there's no vowels there, it actually becomes pretty tricky to try to figure out what this word means. But Xerxes is the Greek name, Ahasuerus is the Hebrew name, and then the true, honest Persian name, I can't pronounce. Starts with a K though, I can tell you that. But if I gave you the string of letters, all of you would say, yeah, I can't, I don't even have a guess. He was a real life person. We're not talking about a story with characters. Because a story gives what impression? That it's make-believe. And when I say characters are what? Are fictional. Like Huckleberry Finn. This is not a story with characters. This is an account in a historical place at a historical time with people from history, and it all unfolds. But there's even more for us to consider. So in verse 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that it was in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all of his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces, being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So that sounds like a what? That sounds like a what? Sounds like a pretty extensive. Because our banquets last how long? A few hours, one night. If you go back in history, wedding feasts, New Testament era, could last how long? Jewish wedding feasts could last several days. Here's a feast that lasts how long? 6 months. Now, that very fact may make you think what? Okay, this is ridiculous. I mean, no one's going to have a feast for 180 days. Here's what this was. This was essentially a planning stage for wars. The sworn Persian enemies at that time were the Greeks. This is just about 100 years before Alexander the Great. Of course, what made Alexander so great? He conquers the world, but how does he, at such a young man, be able to conquer the world? What gives Alexander the step up that he needs? It's his dad. So we're talking about a time period not that long before Philip II of Macedon is going to be born, who is the father of Alexander the Great. And Persia and Greece are sworn enemies of one another. This 6-month feast, which seems so unbelievable that you've got to just write Esther off and then therefore write off all of the Old Testament and then write off the entire Bible, is a planning ceremony. In 480, Greece is going to attack, or Persia is going to go over and attack Greece. They're going to fight 2 famous battles, the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis. This was the planning stage of those battles. Epic, important battles in the history of the world. And they're happening right, the planning for it, the staging for it is happening right now. So this is before these 2 battles are going to be fought. As we move through the book, like I said, the book covers a time span of about 10 years. As we move through the book, Xerxes is going to come back from these battles, and the book doesn't really mention it, but he's going to come back from these battles, and Esther being the queen, everything just continues right along. But history, well-known, verified, certifiable, actual history is happening in the background. And that's just a point, honestly, that I couldn't walk away from, even though I burned up a few minutes of time here. We had to talk about this. This is not just stuff that's made up, that has no connection to the history of the world in general. This is taking place, and this is taking place right before a massive event in world history. So, battles of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis. So, at the feast, what does Xerxes want to do? So now he has a feast lasting 7 days. And these were for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And it describes the way it looked, with white and blue linen curtains fastened on the cords of fine linen and purple, silver rods, marble pillars. Couches were of gold and silver on the mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, white, and black marble. You think that those are useless details, but I'll tell you what ends up being incredibly helpful for us is that the Bible mentions these kinds of details, and then what archaeology will go and do, it may not find the actual floor that whoever is writing it, likely Mordecai, is describing here, but it will find floors or mosaics. It will find palaces that are constructed using the same kind of architecture that the writer's describing. So when it has these little elements like it, we would kind of think they're just kind of a cast-off, but they're not. They set it in a contextual time, and that contextual time can be usually verified via archaeology. So they have all of this stuff in verse 7, and not only do they have fine architecture, but what else did they have in verse 7? What else do they have in verse 7? In abundance, wine. And so after they had been drinking, what does Xerxes want to do? He wants to show off his queen. Now, who is his queen? Vashti. And what does Vashti say? She said no. Now again, to be as accurate as possible, we don't know why she said no. Because the text never tells us. What would be a guess? There was actually one scholar who had stated that in verse 11, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown. There was actually one commentator who said that that was all she was going to be wearing. Now, I don't, again, there's no way on earth that you could verify that. But there definitely feels to be what about Vashti? A sense of what to her? A sense of propriety to her. However she was going to be displayed, which again, I'm not in any way saying that she was going to be completely without any clothes on except with her crown. But the way that she was going to be displayed, she most definitely what? She didn't like it. And she ended up, because she wouldn't allow herself to be, and I'll just keep using the word displayed in this way. Again, I don't even know what that entails. But because she didn't allow herself to be displayed in that way, what did she lose? Okay, so she lost being queen. I can kind of maybe assume and be at least in the ballpark that when you take a stand like that against your husband in front of all of these guests who are very important, she could have even expected what? To lose her life. Again, all we can do is make assumptions, but if I'm going to assume someone who's willing to say no and at least have the possibility of being put to death, it had to be what? It had to be, yeah, it had to be some kind of circumstance that wasn't good. We sometimes talk a lot about Esther, but we don't talk that much about Vashti. I understand why, because I can't really assign a motive to her. But what are you thankful for as far as Vashti is concerned? She stood up. Yeah, she stood up. She was not a woman that in the ancient Near Oriental East who was willing to just kind of be mowed over by a man. She stood up and she stood her ground. And Esther's going to showcase that exact same kind of bravery. So these are two actually very strong women. I really, really wish that we had more background into what was taking place with Vashti. But that just, God didn't see fit to tell us that part of the account. But this book details not just one strong woman, but two strong women who stood up for themselves. Probably Vashti, who stood up for a sense of propriety and a sense of morality and a sense of worth as far as her being a woman. But again, all I can do is guess about that. So, because she refused, then they, of course, deposed her. In chapter 2, what have you got to do? So they depose her, so you've got to what? You've got to find a replacement. So after these things, starting in chapter 2, verse 1, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all of the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather all of the beautiful young women to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So chapter 2 now starts telling us about what? The search, the selection process. The women were brought and prepared. How long did that last? Did you catch that? Because I meant to mention it during the meeting because I told you to read the book, but now it's been 2 weeks and I meant to give a reminder, and I hope you guys remembered and read it. But how long were they prepared? A year. A year they were prepared. And I can only assume when you're thinking about a monarch and you think about bringing in a new queen, what all do you have to think about? Certainly as you look in chapter 2, you're definitely getting the feeling that when she was brought into the presence of the king, that there probably was, sexual contact. Whatever woman that wasn't going to be the queen was probably kind of moved off into a group A or a group B as far as the concubines are concerned. And that's actually not a flippant statement. When you read the text, it does indeed seem like that is the case. So as a monarch, what would you be looking for? Of course, you would want a queen that's what? That's beautiful, that's attractive. But what else? Okay, she probably would be good to have some kind of political connection. Now remember, we need to kind of set this up. At this point in time, what had happened with the Jews? Okay, so in Ezra, remember, how many times did the Jews go back? 3 times. The first time was the big group of people that went back. There were almost how many of those? Almost 50,000 of those. This has already taken place. But something about Babylonian captivity, or a fact about Babylonian captivity, it apparently was so, I don't really know what the word I don't know what the right word, mild, perhaps. The Babylonian captivity was so mild that actually a lot of them did what? They stayed. They stayed. When we come back, when we get through Esther and we come back to Ezra, and it's time for Ezra to go, the amount of people that went back with Ezra were significantly smaller. So much so that in a week or 2 time, when we look at it, Ezra's trying to recruit people, trying to get people actively to come back with him, because most of them are satisfied to stay. You've got a sizable Jewish population that's there. And because you have this sizable Jewish population, well then you would think as a monarch that her being able to kind of bring in goodwill of this probably a large group of people would not be bad at all. So kind of being politically connected is a positive. What else would you want to look for? What else would you want to look for? This is coming up, I didn't want to use up time, but I'm going to talk about murmuring and complaining tonight. It just seems like the season for it. it's just a nice reminder. So we elect people in part who look what? Who look what? Who look the part, who look presidential. I get an email every day, and it tells about what's going on in the world, but it also tells about events in the past in American history. And I think it was Wednesday or Thursday that was the anniversary of the first debate between Nixon and Kennedy, which was the first what? Televised debate. The first televised debate. And there was a lot of years of spread in difference between the ages of Nixon, who was older, and Kennedy, who was younger. But there was and if you've ever seen, of course, it was before my time, but I've watched clips of it before. And Nixon looked nervous. He was sweating. He was having difficulty answering it. It wasn't his night. It wasn't his medium. And Kennedy looked confident. He looked self-assured. He was able to answer questions. That night, he looked what? Presidential. So when you select a queen, you want her to look what? Don't say presidential. See, my mind would have just still been hung that way. You want her to look what? Queenly. You want her to look regal. So there's actually a lot. You would think, well, Esther must have been beautiful. Well, she probably was beautiful, but there's a lot more to think about. And the kind of character that this young, God-fearing woman brought to the table made Xerxes select her and choose her. And that is, of course, to her everlasting credit that she was the kind of person that someone would want to have representing or co-representing their nation, their country. So we get to the end of chapter 2, and something happens in the end of chapter 2 that essentially sets up the rest of the book. In chapter 2, we are introduced, of course we know about Esther, but we're introduced to someone else, very, very important in the book, Mordecai. Who was Mordecai? Her uncle. And Mordecai, what position did Mordecai have? He was some kind of what? Some kind of official in the court. What exactly it was, it doesn't really tell us, but he was some kind of official in the court. It was Mordecai's connection that had basically brought Esther in and made her a part of this large group of women who's going to be considered as the next queen. So we're introduced to Mordecai. And again, something happens in the end of chapter 2 that will set up the rest of the book, or it'll play very heavily into the plot of the book a little bit later on. Starting in verse 19, when virgins were gathered a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now, what was the significance of sitting inside the king's gate? What was the king's gate? Right, it's where business of the court is conducted. This is just, in my setting in rural Tennessee at my age, this was just starting to go out of vogue when I was a young man. If you wanted to be in the happening place in town, where were you? You were at the courthouse. You sat in the courthouse lawn, in the benches, or you sat on the steps of the courthouse. That's where things happened. And when I was a young boy, I still distinctly remembered that the important men in town, the noteworthy men in town, spent some amount of time in the courthouse lawn. Now we've probably kind of moved on from that. But it's like sitting at the king's gate with Mordecai. So he's sitting at the king's gate. And in verse 20, now Esther had not revealed to her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. He told her, don't tell anyone that you're a Jew. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. And in those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both of them were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. What does Mordecai do? He saved the king's life. And he tells it through Esther. It's all recorded, and the threat is taken care of. And apparently, Xerxes or Ahasuerus never what? Never knew anything about it. And then, as we'll see as it plays on a little bit later on, was never rewarded for it. So we move into chapter 3. And what does chapter 3 tell us? And who gets introduced in chapter 3? Haman. So who is Haman? Who is Haman? Okay, so here was someone, again, pretty high up in the court. How would you describe Haman? Yeah, kind of the king's right-hand man. How else would you describe him? He had a deep character flaw. Very what? Yeah, very arrogant and very, very petty. So let's read this, and it'll be just about time for us to go. In verse 2 of chapter 3, and all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai, what? Wouldn't do it. And it made Haman what? Furious. So furious that we're going to find out next week, he didn't just deal with Haman. He was going to what? He was going to kill all of them. Kill all of them. That's a pretty petty person. So that's what we'll start looking at chapter 3 next time and continue on just summarizing the book.